So for your vacation photo, this is the background photo that I've chosen to use. It's a good size. It's a decent size. I'm zoomed out at 25%, so I can tell it's a high quality photo. I'm also going to open, so by going to File, Open, my photo of, we're going to say this is myself. You guys are going to take photos of yourself either in the hallway or at home or wherever to grab these things. Using your highlighting skills that you learned on the Mini-Me project, you're going to use either the lasso tool or the magnetic lasso tool, as well as like adding and subtracting from the selection to select yourself as closely and as carefully as possible. It's actually better to accidentally select too much rather than not enough, because then you can always remove it if you have to. I've already done this, so we're not sitting here watching me select this. I saved the selection, so I'm just going to say load selection, and I've got a Brody selection here. So I've already got him selected here. I'm going to zoom in, make sure I don't have any spots that are missing or anything like that. All right. Now, I'm going to do a simple Control-C. I'm going to go over here to my background, and I'm going to do a Control-V to paste it in. Now, obviously, the size is wrong, okay, as it's coming over here. Pasted it in. It's way too big. The sizing doesn't match. So that's where I'm going to go to Edit, Transform Scale. You learned this skill on the Mini-Me. And I'm going to scale this down to what I think is going to be a more appropriate size. Now, this is when Brody was younger, so he's going to be quite a bit smaller than people. So I'm going to kind of put him right here. So he's actually kind of layered in front of that student. All right, so let's call that close. I can adjust it further if I need to. Now, the next thing I need to do is go in here and I want to adjust what's called levels. Make this match, because this is obviously out in the sun, and then the background is sort of an overcast day. And some of this is a little bit of sort of experimenting. So if you are the more skilled you get with Photoshop, the more you'll be able to go into this and just kind of know what to do by eye. But I've got layer 1 here selected, which is Brody. And I'm going to go up to Image Adjustments. Now, this is one way I can do image adjustments. I can go in here and individually kind of adjust things like brightness, contrast, levels, curves, exposure. And a lot of this is just sort of going in and seeing what it looks like. So, for example, if I want to do hue saturation, all right, hue kind of is more color-based. Saturation is how bled out you are. So I'm going to actually lower his saturation a little bit. I'm going to lower the brightness a little bit here because it's sort of a darker day. And some of this is doing it subtly rather than like going in and trying to really change these hugely. Another way to do this, besides going to image adjustments, right? There's all these different kinds. There's this filter called a camera raw filter. It's sort of a new feature that has popped out. Click on camera raw filter. It'll open up a second window. And this window looks like this. All right. So this is a little hard to do on one screen because it's only giving you this preview. It kind of covers up your actual photo here, but it gives you all of these different adjustments all on one screen that you can kind of mess with. So I'm going to move this over to the side a little bit. I'm going to shrink it down and just sort of get a preview of what all these different adjustments could do. So, for example, if I want to lower the exposure a little bit, maybe lower the contrast and some highlights because it's kind of a dark day. Maybe I want to up the shadows a little bit, lower the whites, up the blacks, and the texture clarity, dehaze. You can kind of see what those are. I like the hazing effect on sort of an overcast day like this. And I'm going to click OK. And you'll see it's sort of a subtle effect, but he's definitely darker. All right, so it's still blending in. I'm going to kind of keep working through that. That's your first step. You've got him in there. You got him resized. Definitely go through and change some of these different color levels and exposure levels. The second part of this is I'm going to go in and I'm going to magnify or zoom myself in here. And notice he's very, very clear on the edges, whereas my original photo is a little bit blurry. So this tool over here called the blur tool. Okay, it's hidden underneath the smudge tool, but the blur tool allows me to go along these edges, and I have to have layer 1 here selected and just sort of blur my edges very subtly. If you do this too much, you'll end up kind of blurring yourself completely out. But as I go along these edges, it just sort of softens them a little bit. This is also where, when you're going along these edges, if you notice that you accidentally got too much of your old background. So for example, if I zoom in right here and I want to look at this finger and I accidentally got something from the old background, I could always go in here, lasso it out and say, oop, I didn't mean to have that part right there. I'm just going to delete that out. That might help. Control D does a deselect, by the way, to get yourself back out. All right. And this is one of those things where it takes you a little time to use this blur tool to really kind of blur out these edges. Don't get too much. And this is a lot of times the difference between one that looks very realistic and one that just does not, because it's clearly way too clear. It almost looks like a pair of scissors cut you out. Here on his feet, I'm going to blur those out a little bit. Now, there is another tool here that's kind of cool if you're trying to do overlayers, and it's called this smudge tool. Now, there's nothing on here I need to necessarily smudge out. Oop, I've got a crazy brush here. So let's say I have a regular brush. The smudge tool, I'll show you really obviously what it does. It smudges out, oop, there we go, the edges, and even almost further blurs it. Almost think of it like your finger on like a pencil drawing where it smudges the edges. Sometimes it's real subtle. I actually have the strength turned way down at 50%. If you do it at 100%, it almost looks like a wet painting, and it doesn't quite look right. All right. So your second step is to go along your edges, use your blur tool. Third step here is to add the realism of a shadow, and it's actually a little easier than it looks. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my layer 1 over here, and I'm just going to say duplicate layer. All right. I'm going to call this shadow, just so I can keep track of what's what. My shadow now is on top. I want to drag it over. All right, I've duplicated myself again, just like the Mini-Me project. But I'm going to drag this shadow and put it behind layer 1. And then I'm going to adjust all of these things, but the biggest one I'm going to do is exposure. I'm going to knock that exposure all the way down. So it's basically a black outline shadow of myself or of Brody's. All right. And then I'm going to go to edit, transform, just like where I would go for scale, but this time I'm going to do distort. And distort will allow me to grab these edges and flip myself upside down. I'm going to put myself right here, right underneath how a shadow would be, kind of looking at the angle of everybody else's shadow so I can really lightly see this shadow. It's right there. It's real subtle, so I'm going to kind of stretch it out like that. Obviously, that's way too strong of a shadow at this point, but we will fix it out. All right, so I've got it flipped. Now I'm going to turn down the opacity, just like when we did our cartoon project. Turn it way down. And this one, I'm going to turn it way, way down because the shadows are not very bold. If it was a sunny day out, it would be a little bit more bold. This is just sort of a reflection almost. And then I'm going to add one more effect, and that's going to be a blur. So I'm going to go to filter, and I like to use the Gaussian blur. Seems to be the most realistic one here. So if I turn down the blur radius, maybe almost to that level, now I've got a shadow there that has added an element of realism. And if I continued to work on this, and probably a little bit the fact that everybody else is wearing winter coats and he's in his shorts, obviously adds to some of the fake looking of this, or he could just be wearing shorts in the middle of the winter. But that's how you're inserting yourself and then adding the realism to it. Shadows, working with adjustments, and also working with blurring your edges. Okay. And as you continue to add layers to yourself, it will look more and more realistic.